So without further ado, I want to introduce our next speaker. It is Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko. She lectures statistics and economics to MBA students at the business school, and she's also an activist for women's rights. And I've spent some time with her, and I see her as my friend. And she is a wonderful poet. So there's this humanness about her, and I can't wait to hear what she has to tell us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Neil. I'm not going to share any poetry with you today, unfortunately. I've been asked to set the scene for you, and interestingly, one of the guests who's here said they want to know, should they actually stay in South Africa, right? So what I'm going to do this morning is try and set the scene and give a little bit of background to the economy. I'm very passionate about economics and economic development, and hopefully my guests will also carry me along as I go, or walk with me as I go, as I'm setting the scene for our keynote speaker. But I think importantly is for us to understand where are we as a country. I think I have a very optimistic view in terms of what we need to do going forward, but I also need to say, what is the status quo? Where are we and where should we go? So I'm here to set the scene. I don't have a lot of time, and so I'm going to get straight into it. So where are we right now? Oh, you'll see behind me. So I was laughing with Daniel. Now, I'm so bad with marketing and social media and hashtag this and that. By the way, the hashtag for today is homecoming, in case you didn't know. I don't know why we didn't announce that, but if you are going to tweet or talk about today, use the hashtag homecoming if you are. And these are some of the social media handles. So I've done this thing called synchronization. Unlike Daniel, some of us have to get paid to work. I wish I was from the Northern Cape. Maybe it's a Northern Cape thing. But I do teach and I have to get paid because I must live. But these are the handles that I use. I'm a commissioner at the Commission of Gender Equality. It's a Chapter 9 in the country. So it's a nice mix where you can actually, your research outcomes, what you investigate, you can actually also implement and drive the policy recommendations. So I'm very fortunate and I'm very blessed to be able to do both of these things for the country. I'm very passionate about South Africa, and I believe we will get out of the quagmire we're in, despite the darkness that we may see right now. So where are we? So Confucius once said that life is really simple, but we insist on making it complicated. I believe South Africa is pretty much in that boat right now, right? Things are really possibly at a breaking point. I think the direction where we go is really up to us as a country. And where we are, specifically on the state of the economy, you'll see behind me, to your left probably, the GDP numbers that I show over time. What we can see there, and what I'm trying to show you, is on the red. If any of you have never done economics, don't worry, just follow the red line. The red line, you can see, takes a bit of a dip around 2009 and 10, and then it tickles up after the recession. But you can see there that it's downward slanting, right? Can you see that behind me? And what that is saying is that the economy isn't growing as much as we need it to. We know that we are able to inflation target, that is that blue line above. It's bound within that 4 to 6% mark. We know that there's a lot of discussion around the Reserve Bank as to its mandate, what we should do with the Reserve Bank, should we change its mandate. But it's important that the value of money is not eroded. And what that blue line does is to make sure that when you buy bread, when you're paying for fuel, unfortunately they can't manage your fuel levies for you, but the value of money over time is maintained so that the price of goods is actually not too high. So we have been able to do that as a country, but we have not been able to grow. Okay, and I think that as a result, you see there that we've got very high level of unemployment. It worsens with the youth. I'm not here to paint a bad picture, but we need to know where we are. So you see there that 57.4%, 38.2% if you widen that band of youth. South Africa's youth is like mid-30s, you can still be the youth. That's because of our history. Poverty is high, and year on year, we're seeing that estimates for this year for growth is around 1.3, 1.5%. That is not great. Where will growth come from? We heard Daniel mention right at the start, enterprise development is fundamental to growing any economy, but you've got to create an enabling environment. And we've mentioned the issue of inflation. So where is the rest of the world in comparison to South Africa? Where is the rest of the world? You see there that the rest of the world, we are part of the developing bracket in terms of economies, right? We are what you call developing economies. So that orange line that's at the top, most emerging markets are growing faster than your advanced world. So right now we're sitting at between 4.5% growth on emerging markets. That's your Russias, your Chinas, your Brazils, Indonesia, and so forth. South Africa is supposed to be with that band, right? But we're pulling ourselves and the rest of Africa down with our 0.7% growth. We can get that up, right? The developing world is growing at a meager 2 to 3% per annum growth. And there's a lot of things happening around there as well. But I think one of the fundamental things that we need to push is productive sectors. We need to look at how do we get our industry up? How do we get our agriculture up? How do we get our productive sectors really being part of the growing sectors of the economy? Because that has not been the case. And so you see behind me, what I'm showing you here is the graphs you see is the contribution of mining and agriculture over the last 2 decades. And you can actually see here that mining and agriculture, on the whole, if I were to break it down on a quarter-by-quarter basis, you'll see mostly 3 of the 4 quarters on both, they decline, negative growth, not increasing. And that's because of policy issues, that's because of sectoral support that is not provided, and also because of uncertainty in some of these sectors that we need to look at as a country and as a government. So there's a lot of policy uncertainty, but also you're seeing exit out of this sector by your big multinationals, and maybe we'll hear more from our keynote, given his history around that, and some of the indicators as to why these things are actually driven out, or multinationals are not necessarily seeing South Africa as lucrative as it was 10, 20 years ago. But that's really one of the key issues that we need to look at. We've got to grow our productive sectors. This is something that will enable SMMEs to grow. This is something that will enable us to employ more, because SMMEs, on average, in most growing economies, are the biggest job creators. They're the ones who employ the most. They have multiplier effects, and they're independent. And so we've got to look at ways to support our growing enterprises on the back of that. Now, inequality in South Africa is a problem. So I do want to say, last year we had the 100th year anniversary of Stellenbosch, most of you will know, and I was saying we're going to have a 100-year party. I mean, a 100-day party, not a 100-year party, wow. A 100-day party. And one of the things I mentioned, I remember we would have discussions, and I'd say the legacy of Stellenbosch enables it after 100 years to actually turn around its legacy. What will Stellenbosch look like in the next 100 years? What does it mean to be a Stellenbosch alumni? After 100 years, what would Stellenbosch have contributed given its history and its past? And I believe around the issues of inequality and poverty, I believe as Stellenbosch alumnus, there has got to be a concise effort that we make as individuals and South Africans, and specifically as Stellenbosch alumnus, to decisively intervene around the issue of inequality and poverty, whatever sector you are in, wherever you are actually located. So currently we have more than 30 million South Africans living in poverty. What does that mean? That means that the majority of our people are living on less than 1,000 rand a month. Hunger poverty is another indice that you can look at. But in terms of inequality, the large majority of our wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few. So that would mean that 40% of the bottom half of our population earn less than 8.3% of the total wealth of South Africa. There's like half of this room, if you were all of South Africa, half of this room earn less than a percentage, one of the front rows in terms of level of income. So the inequality is level of South Africa's gross inequality. We've got the highest level of Gini coefficient. And so we're seeing this perpetuate itself. I won't go into these numbers, but it talks to hunger poverty. People have very little money for food. People have, I mean, if you think then medical, healthcare, expenditure around that. So the result is high level of dependency, but that can be turned around, I believe. There's things that need to be done that can be turned around. But the big thing is that unemployment drives poverty and education drives up employability. So there's a large correlation to improving education outcomes and seeing growth and employability and driving down poverty. So we've got to see it as a good thing that young people access post-school education. Post-matric qualification, Stats SA poverty show that the incidence of poverty with those who have post-matric qualification and the incidence of poverty in household is far rapidly lower. So you can see that the incidence of poverty is 8.4% in households without post-school education. That's 8% versus almost more than 80% if households don't have anyone in that household who have got post-school education. So don't see it as a negative thing that there's free education for those that are under the 300,000 median level. Because South Africans are very negative. You know, we see it as a bad thing. Let me tell you, this is one of the big boosters that could drive up growth in the country, although it always comes at a cost. Right? That's the reality. So we've got to look at that. So I look at the overall, I'm about to enter into the last 3 slides after this, but South Africa and Africa, the economists and the world always have a narrative about us, right? We are not the ones who determine our narrative. We see there around the 2000s, we were told that we were a hopeless continent. We see in around 2002, they decided there was the Sustainable Development Conference that took place here. And around 2003, we saw George Bush with his military aid coming to help us, but the ambient was that you have to get the military weapons from the United States. So there was always a conditionality tied to that aid. But I'm saying that the narrative around Africa and her growth is determined by other people. Or do we allow it to be determined by other people? My view is that let us determine our own narrative about our country, about our continent, about where we want to go. And I believe that it's all good and well that the economist has a view, but the question is there's no country that grows without patriotic views by the citizens themselves. There's no country that grows, and no continent, by the way. China could never have grown if Chinese did not decide they love their China, they are going to grow China, they are going to incentivize Chinese, they're going to grow their own businesses, they're going to hire local people, all those type of things. Without Chinese doing that and making that decision, I can tell you now, we will not have seen the last 10 years of 6 to 14% growth that we see in China. And South Africans have to change their mindsets. I'm just setting the scene. I'm just setting the scene. I'm not going to go too much into this. All I'm proving here is that the primary and the secondary sector, which is where labor-intensive growth occurs, have been declining. The majority of our growth is coming from what we call tertiary services, financial sector, real estate, government services, community and social support. But the real indices that we need to see going up are going down. We need farmers, we need young black farmers, we need people to enter into agriculture, we need people to enter manufacturing. We cannot be deindustrializing, not in South Africa. We've got the fundamental infrastructure in place, we've got advanced infrastructure, and some of the logistics networks are there, but we're seeing deindustrialization. This has to be turned around. And it will take South Africans to do it, not only government. Surprise, we always want to relay everything to government. Bad thing is that we are paying for government's bad decisions. So the indebtedness of government, you see there, the primary balance, what this is showing you is that we are spending more than we have. So there's a negative budget deficit. It's between 4.2 and 4.6% in the short to medium term. The problem is that we are then servicing debt and spending a lot of our revenue around this. This is what the numbers on the behind you are telling you. And the result is the debt to GDP outlook is not so good. So there's a threshold of around 60% that you shouldn't surpass. We're not there yet. We're around 55.9, but we are creeping towards 60%. Not good. So we've got to try and spend less, but we are trying to manage it. Where do we want to go? Where do we want to go? I'm going to show you where some African countries have gone. This is in less than a decade of change. Some over 2 decades, but look at the fastest growing economies in Africa. You see here, before I show you those slides, is the view on Africa. Again, the same headlines from The Economist, right? A lot of us get our narratives from the media. I want to say to you, don't get your narrative from the media. Get your narrative from yourself about where you want your country to go, about where you want to see South Africa and its contribution to Africa and the global economy. I do believe that this is positive, that we have Africa rising and a hopeful continent, but this cannot be the end of it, because this can change. They can change this narrative, and we don't know what they'll say in the next few months about South Africa. But the fastest growing economies in the world over the last 3 years, I've shown you here. Most of these economies, Ethiopia, DRC, Cote d'Ivoire, you see Mozambique, Tanzania, Rwanda, African economies. On average, all of them are growing faster than 7% growth. Compounded average growth rate, all of these are higher than 7% growth consistently. 2015, 2016, 2017. Is it possible in Africa? The facts are showing us absolutely. Do you have to have mining as the core component? No. I'm showing you Rwanda as a fact. I'm showing you Cote d'Ivoire. These are cocoa bean, coffee, palm oil, and you see in Rwanda, agri-processing, tourism. These are your services and agriculture economy. You do not have to have minerals to drive growth in an economy. You can drive growth in an economy at these levels, even with primary sector growth. But you've got to have the relevant incentives, and you've got to have the relevant support. And industry must enter into these key sectors so that it can actually grow. But what you can see here is that Africa is not necessarily doing too badly. South Africa is, but I believe leadership is one of the factors, and we need to change it. But leadership in all of these countries hasn't always been stable, but they've been able to get it right. Particularly, we see changes in Rwanda and Tanzania in terms of leadership. But I do believe that some of these countries in Africa have seen pivotal change in their economy because of the change in the functioning leadership and governance across private, public, and the civil society. So how do we get there, South Africa? I believe that we need these 4 key things that are outlined here. We need to have African models of growth. We've got to look at using sectoral focus, but also looking at how can we grow and diversify our exports, how can we grow our economies, how can we have underpinning infrastructure, logistics, also look at any type of these things that I mentioned here that will enable us to grow our value chains. Secondly, how do we mobilize resources? I don't believe in debt. I believe that unless you're using debt for productive sectors, debt will make you fall into a debt trap. You've got to look at pension funds, municipal bonds, how you use microfinance, development finance tools to actually try and grow your economy, and underpinned by mobile technology and ICT. Human capital is core. Human capital, without individuals, people, young people in the economy, you cannot grow that economy. You've got to enable a capable workforce to be developed. And so I explained that I believe science, technology, and engineering are core, building TVET colleges and capabilities around vocational training. Not everyone should be going to universities, for that matter. I'm not saying Stellenbosch should have less numbers, no. But not everyone needs to get a university qualification. We need more vocational trained people so that we grow our economy. And then, which I will allow our speaker to talk to, good governance. At a national level, we need to maintain it, whether it's provinces, local government. We've got to have good governance underpinning this. Otherwise, you cannot have this type of growth and these underpinning things being driven unless you have judicial independence and you maintain strong institutions. I do believe that we can get there as a country. I do believe some of these things are being put in place. I believe we need emphasis and prioritization, but my view is that we can certainly get there. So Prof. Roo, who's one of our economists at the business school, he set this thing up, and he argues that effective governance and a diversified economy are the key game changers for South Africa. I agree with him. And I believe that in order for us to get to that African renaissance, so most countries are sitting in that quadrant at the back here, which you'll see, which is this resource curse. Because you can have resources, but if you don't manage your economy well, you don't know how to govern, you're going to end up with the resource curse in this quadrant here. You've got to get into this quadrant, but it's only with effective governance and diversifying your economy so you don't rely on one export or one product or good to grow your economy. So it's important that we see how can we get to that African renaissance. We will get there. I believe that if we grow our economy, we diversify our labor and skills force, we produce more. There's incentives in place. There are things that the government is doing. I think that, but it's South Africans, for me, that is the problem. South Africans need to change their mindset. South Africans need to be the ones who are productive and enter into these things and are positive about the likelihood of us being able to intervene within these subsectors. We have to have stabilization of politics and a stable social environment. Entrepreneurs are key. Entrepreneurs are the ones who see the gaps. So entrepreneurs solve problems and provide solutions, right? And you make money while you're doing it. And so it's important that we do that. I believe equitable land ownership is an underpinning so that you have redistribution. How that is done is what is on the cards. And then regional integration and cooperation. But we've got to have a mindset change. Let's work together to build South Africa. Let's work united to build South Africa so that it can become the China of Africa. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Nthabiseng. Isn't it great to have this energy and positivity, huh? I just love it. I just love it.
Thank you.
Nou gaan ons die groot bil voorstel. I'm proud to present to you the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa, Mr. Bonang Mohale. 2 nights ago, we had dinner together, and I don't think I've ever met such a fountain of wisdom and knowledge, and I really appreciated that, and I'm looking forward to your talk today. Thank you, sir.
Molweni mandipotise more. Good morning. I mean, did she wrap it up? Let's put it together. So you can all go home.
Oh, come on.
I think the presentation has been done. I only have a South African passport. I don't have any other. Therefore, for me, I don't have an option. In war, when you invade, especially a small island, the soldiers come up in ships. They look at this island as a prized possession, and they ban their own ships so that they have no escape mechanism, so that failure is no longer an option and victory is assured. That is called the big burning platform issues. When you have many options, sometimes you are in with one leg and out with another, and therefore you don't know whether you Arthur or Martha or anything in between. We have no choice but to make South Africa work. You see, Africa is the most under-marketed and mismarketed continent in the world. Mm. And that narrative is going to be changed by you and I, not by anybody else. Because if we don't think for ourselves, we place our future in the hands of others. It is up to us to create our own new world. And that happens when the narrative changes. Because our attitude at the beginning of a task determines both our expectations and observations. If we think this is God's own country, it is. And if we think we are a hopeless backwater, then we are. Whether you think you can or you can't, either way, you are correct. I've taken a keen interest since the 17th of April 1984, when I paid my first visit to China. Because it's the most populous, Tianjin, Guangzhou, and Beijing, which I now visit often. So when you listen to the business people in China and taxi drivers, they talk about us, our country, not somebody else's mess. So Russians, whenever they open their mouth, they say post the 1917 Russian Revolution. That's when our country changed. The Japanese talk about post-Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Here's a small island that has nothing. But they built themselves to being the second biggest economy in the world. 120 million people versus 1.4 billion in China. But they did colonize China and most of Southeast Asia. Today they've got 20 million Japanese people working in China, running companies like Toyota and others. The only country in the world that was hit by an atomic bomb. Not once, but twice, and lived to tell the tale. resilient, hardworking, deceptively respectful, but absolutely determined. In Angola, when they speak, they say, after Savimbi died. I submit that we are going to look back at our fate as a people with great natural endowments to that moment on the 19th of December 2018. But the 54th African National Conference at Nazareth was 2017. And that, to me, is our own tipping point, our inflection point. When we were gifted with a new president of the African National Congress, Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa, we look back and say, that's when our fortunes turned. And they did. Because up until then, we had at least 9 years of wasted opportunities and wasted years. And he came in as a deputy president of the country and broke his own laws. On the Thursday morning at the Hilton, we were having our usual pre-Davos breakfast, the 47th Summit of Summits, my 9th. And he said, we're going to Davos. When we come back, there will be no country, because Eskom would have defaulted on its debt. And when Eskom goes down, we all go down. Because with each day of a blackout, the economy loses 2 to 3 billion a day. So he said, I want that by 1 o'clock, when we leave that evening to go to Davos, we have implemented a new board with the new executives. Because that was our demand, to say fire the whole board of Eskom, because this was the crucible of state capture. And fire every single solitary one of the executives that are implicated in state capture. The Minister of Public Enterprises was Lynn Brown. He asked for 5 names from Business Leadership South Africa, and we did. And 5 of those now sit on the board of Eskom. That Monday, when it was announced, JP Morgan led a conversation with 20 billion lending to Pagamani Hadebe's team, chaired by Dr. Jabulani Albert Mabuza. And since then, the battle of restoring hope began. Eskom matters, because even though we have more than 700 state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies, 2/3 of the debt is just Eskom, at 491 billion, going up to 500 billion. Of the 675 billion government guarantees, they've already accessed 350 billion of that. And Eskom must be saved, because we have no option but to make sure that we do. This is the 4th biggest utility in the world. The only one in the world that does the 3 functions into one: generation, transmission, and distribution. And that's why it has become so complex, not because no one single individual can manage it, because we wrecked it, certainly in the last 10 years. 2007, it had 32,000 employees. Today, it has 48,000. An EXCO of 8, 20, now 80 people. Because it was used really just as a repository for cronies. So now we are in a spot of bother, and we need to fix it. So if I pick up from Khaitsediaka and Nthabiseng where she left off, you see, we all were jubilant on the 27th of April, 1994, when we ushered in the first democratically elected president, Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela, after 350 years of subjugation, exclusion, oppression, and exploitation. And he inherited a technically bankrupt country. In 5 years, the GDP quadrupled. So the slope of the curve is facing upwards and forwards. He literally only led for 3 of those 5 years. The last 2 he delegated to Thabo Mbeki. Thabo Mbeki's administration added on that trajectory by giving us 43 consecutive quarters of positive GDP growth. We were adding 500,000 black families into the middle class, defined as a combined household income of $8,000 to $10,000 per annum. In 2007, on the way to Polokwane, the wheels came off, when in 2009, we had a president called Jacob Zuma. And the industrial scale looting happened. And since then, we have really squandered our opportunities. So what would happen if we calculated and extrapolated to say, had we continued just on that trajectory, instead of a precipitous drop that we saw in 2009? South Africa's unemployment rate today will be at 16, not at 27.5%, using the narrow definition. Our GDP would be 6%, not 0.7 on average. Last year, 1.3, because the last quarter positively surprised. Would have banked into our fiscus 1 trillion South African rands. Because in 2017, that's how much we collected through the South African Revenue Service, 1.14 trillion. This entity that we created to show that we have abilities and capabilities. There was no SARS when Mandela came on. There was the Department of Expenditure, of Finance, of Customs and Excise. We put all of them together and created a revenue service that was in the top 5 in the world, with men and women that were prepared to humble themselves and indeed learn. Tax morality increased. And if you do the math, last year we collected 1.4 trillion South African rands, having paid the VAT refunds. So you divide 1.4 trillion rands with the 57.8 million South Africans, there's no reason why any of us should go to bed hungry. But the math doesn't add up. Most economies in the world are diamond-shaped. Fewer who are super rich and fewer who live in self-perpetuating vicious cycle of abject poverty. And a majority in the middle class so that they can sustain all of us. The structure of the South African economy is a triangle. Yeah. The majority of people are at the bottom. 17 million of us are on social security. Only 16 million are gainfully employed. 13.5 million of those are the 86 CEOs that I represent in Business Leadership South Africa. 53 of them are more than half the GDP of this country. And 4.8 million South Africans are responsible for more than 80% of the SARS revenue. So you can see it's not sustainable. That's why South Africa must be saved. So when we went to the World Economic Forum, our message was consistent, crisp, concise, and precise. And it is the same message and the conversations we had when we hosted the Job Summit, and we came with 5 package of labor reforms. And we speak only about one, which is the national minimum wage. But there were 5. That was the same message that we gave when we hosted the investment summit. And we had commitments approved by the boards in projects of 296 billion South African rands, out of a target that was set for all of us by Honorable President Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa. It feels wonderful to say honorable again. Of $100 billion of foreign direct investment. That must be fronted by domestic direct investment of another $100 billion in 5 years, which is on average 20 billion per annum. So we are taking ahead of that target because there are many more people outside that want South Africa to desperately succeed. But we must want it bad enough because we have run out of options. You see, Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa is not our second chance. He's our last chance. Because if we mess it up this time, we'll be another failed African country. 1.3 billion people, 54 countries that speak 2,000 languages, with a combined continental GDP of $6.4 trillion. The biggest economy being Nigeria at $420 billion, and South Africa at $350 billion. And those 5 key messages were simply, number 1, we need to grow the size of this economy. This notion of an inclusive socio-economic growth, which by very definition is transformative. You see, business cannot continue to be an island of prosperity in a sea of poverty. Business must continue to do well by doing good. So the parable of the 4 pieces of bread and 2 pieces of fish, the miracle is in the fact that when most of us go on picnic, we carry much more than we need, and we always bring something back with us. So when we throw all of it into a pot and we dare share, there will be more than enough for everyone. So John 6 verse 12 says, once everybody has had their fill, Jesus said to his disciple, collect all the leftovers so that nothing goes to waste. So South Africa will succeed because all of us are going out of our way to share with others. This notion of lifting as you rise. Because there is nothing that is more profound as an exercise of the heart than extending a hand down and picking up another human being. Lift yourself and you can lift the world. If we lift South Africa as the people in this room, the 57.8 million South Africans will be lifted because South Africa must be saved. You see, nature, thank you. You see, nature does nothing for itself. It does everything for others. And nature is a wonderful metaphor for business. Rivers don't drink their own water. Trees don't eat their own fruit. The sun does not shine so that it feels warm. The flowers give off the fragrances, not so that they can smell Fontainebleau, but so that others can enjoy the beautiful scent of roses. So it's incumbent upon all of us that the more we rise, the more we should lift others as we rise. Because we only have one life. So if you accumulate more than enough to last you 3 lives, and yet your neighbor is hungry, how can that be right? My grandmother used to say, when your neighbor is hungry, you are the one that can't sleep at night. The second message was that we must fix Eskom. The third message we gave was that we need to fix all government institutions, starting with state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies, because they can be engines for growth. But all of them, bar maybe no more than I can count in my one hand, are trading recklessly where their liabilities exceed their assets. Only a few are able to run off their own balance sheet. Centec, Transnet, Airports Company of Southern Africa, Telkom, which like Eskom was broken because the politicians were feeding at the trough, and they had Dr. Jabulani Albert Mabuza as the chairman and Sipho Maseko as the CEO, and he was able to say to the politicians, we're not going to give you access to the value chain of Telkom, just give Sipho space to run this entity. Today, government gets R1 billion a year, every year, as dividends from Telkom as part of their 38.5% equity. None of the other SOEs pay dividends, but they act like unrehabilitated alcoholics, coming back every year for more bailouts. The fourth, we said we need to continue to attract and retain foreign direct investment. You see, when you choose to be borrowed to the hilt like we are, you have to play by the rules of the rating agencies. You can't question them. We don't like what they're saying. If you don't like debt, build your own mud house. Don't go to the bank and apply for a bond. But once you have applied for the bond, guess whose rules prevail? The banks, not yours. So no political machinations and pronouncements will change that. And we know that rating agencies are really only looking for 4 things. They're looking for economic, fiscal, and institutional strength, and ability and susceptibility to major risk events. This notion called resilience, because resilience in Africa must be much more than the food, energy, water nexus. The last one, we spoke about the South African Reserve Bank. Because at the 54th ANC conference in December of 2017, some of the comrades took a resolution that says the mandate of the Reserve Bank can't just be monetary policy and currency stability. It must be creating jobs and also economic growth. And by so doing, they demonstrated their ignorance and laziness to read our best constitution in the world. Because the Reserve Bank derives its mandate directly from the Constitution. It's one of the Chapter 9 institutions. And when you read the Constitution, it says, as part of the mandate of the Reserve Bank, one line, it's about balanced and sustainable growth. It already exists. They take another resolution because they didn't read.
Comrades.
So gone are the days where business used to fold its arms and say, no, it's government's business to fix this economy. That's why I'm leading Business Leadership South Africa, because we wanted to roll our sleeves and get in there and say, what can business do? And we said we need to lead on at least 6 things, and I will not unpack them in the interest of time. Big burning platform issues that business must lead on. Number 1 is land. You see, we didn't put land on the agenda. The EFF did, not the ANC. And now they're responding to the EFF and they're talking about expropriation without compensation. And again, when you marvel at what we've been gifted by our forebears in our constitution, Section 25, Article 3A, addresses land reform. There are 3 components: land restitution, land redistribution, and land development. And 3A talks about property rights. The 8th line from the bottom, it says, when conditions of fair and equitable have been fulfilled, compensation can be down to 0. So land expropriation without compensation already exists and it's adequately covered in our constitution. And we take a resolution, we start a conversation that lasts 9 months as to whether we should do expropriation without compensation. The constitution says we should and must. And we say it's the best constitution in the world because, not because we are clever, but because we stole unashamedly from others. So 1955, clip down, the Freedom Charter says South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. That's why South Africa is going to work, because the victors did not choose to chase away the vanquished and drive them into the sea. South Africans said we need each other. And together, how can we succeed together? And our preamble to our constitution starts by saying, we, the people, not the politicians, united in our diversity, because we don't look the same. We are young and old, male and female, black and white, and poverty still has a black face. The last piece says we need to acknowledge and admit our past injustices, and it mandates every single solitary one of us. It implores us to correct these injustices, not government, the people who are sitting in this room. It's a mandate. The second thing we need to lead on as business is on transformation. So our businesses, from ownership to positions of leadership, C-suite I'm talking about, must look like us. We are not an outpost of Europe. So when I sit with the 86 CEOs of BLSA and look around, you could be anywhere else in the world. 90% of this population is black. Black defined in our then new Labor Relations Act is all those that are excluded on the basis that they are not white. Colored Indians and Africans. That's black. And yet their representation in positions of leadership was 14.3%. On the 20th anniversary of the Employment Commission, Tabia Kabinde, the chairperson, shares the devastating stats with us. We're supposed to be driving it that way because of your and my help. But we went backwards this last year, below 14.3%. And yet 90% of the population is black. 51% of the population is female. And yet female representation in positions of leadership is less than 24%. In 2019, when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, we pay women 87% of what we pay men for work of equal value. And yet, data is replete with examples that companies that are led by women not only are they more financially sustainable, profitable, well-managed and well-run, but they are good places to work for. So transformation means fundamentally breaking with the past. Because after 350 years of colonialism and then apartheid, in between there was separate development that gave us the 1913 Land Act, must give these black people and these women boots and the straps with which they should pull themselves up. Because equality cannot be justice. So if you fundamentally break with the past, it means the future we are co-creating and co-crafting must fundamentally look different and bear no resemblance to this painful past where we come from. This is the pupa that becomes the butterfly. The butterfly doesn't look anything like the pupa. This is the frog that comes from a tadpole. The one looks like a fish, the other one you want to kiss. This is not reformation, because reform implies that you are a chameleon. When you get to the rocks, you are brownish. If you are in lush surroundings, you're green, but there's no change in form and substance. South Africa must be saved, because together we are creating a future that our children will be proud of, because I have nowhere else to go. The third, we are in a fiscal crisis. All the money has been stolen by this past regime. So from the Guptas alone, we estimate that they've been siphoning off on average about 100 billion a year every year. From Eskom, now we know they stole 500 billion. Imagine how many pit latrine toilets would have been built and illuminated in rural areas. How many RDP houses would have been built? How many hospitals? How many jobs could have been created? How many of our children would be enjoying fee-free higher education? Because all you need is just 50 billion to give that to everybody, not to the ones that are now failing the means test of 600,000 combined household income, when the first NSFAS was 350. We are in a crisis. When you hear that through Busasa, they had 80 of our leaders on their monthly payroll. And VBS, 1.8 billion of poor people's monies were stolen, and 30 of those are the people that we call our leaders, were on their monthly payroll. The Gupta leaked emails say this ANC-led government was sending 11 emails an hour. Imagine if this government spent just one day thinking about service delivery, where would we be as a people with great natural endowments? So we are poor by choice, not because of lack of resources. The choice of leadership we have made. General George Patton says, great wars are won by good execution, not good planning, because good execution will save even a mediocre plan. We are bad at doing. If there was a competition for developing plans, South Africa would win hands down. The fourth is to create jobs. Business must lead in creating jobs. We must start first by saving the current jobs that we have and create new ones so that the majority of our people can reclaim their self-worth, their self-respect, and their own self-esteem. There is no pride in waking up every month to be part of the 17 million who are on social security. Let me just talk about the last one in the interest of time, education. We are the only country in Africa that became free from our colonial masters, and we did not intentionally, deliberately, purposefully, and consciously improve the quality of our education. We did this. Only one out of 54 African countries. Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, 1957, the first one to be free, and said, we will not be free until the rest of the continent is free. His third speech talks about Cape to Cairo, Malagasy to Morocco. 80% literacy rate 10 years into democracy. Even Gabriel Robert Mugabe, with 1,001 challenges, today boasts of 94% literacy rate. Not because education is the surest way of transcending social classes, but because when one steadily burns the midnight oil, like Nthabiseng Moleko, one gains access to the domain of knowledge and wisdom, the world of meaning, the world that cannot be conquered without a persistent crusade. Africa must be saved, and it will be saved. Thank you.
Oh.